One page, one sentence. 3 words she had spoken in a language she was certain no one at that table could understand. John Kennedy placed the document in front of her face up and asked her to read it back to him in English. The most quoted congresswoman in America looked down at her own words and went completely silent. 90 seconds before that moment, she had called him an out-of-touch relic on live national TV in front of 3 networks, and the room had moved with her. Now the same room had gone so still you could hear the ventilation system running through the walls of Dirksen 562. Ilhan Omar picked up the page. Her hand was not steady. Every camera in the room registered that it was not steady. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Across the long table, the man she had dismissed as a Louisiana anachronism sat with his reading glasses folded in his palm, unhurried, waiting with the patience of someone who already knew the answer to the question he had asked. He had posed a question that any third grader could answer. Read your own sentence back to the room in the language the room speaks. The woman who had an answer for every hostile question, every hostile committee, every hostile journalist, every hostile editorial board. That woman sat holding the single piece of paper she could not read aloud. Kennedy leaned toward his microphone, gentle as a man talking to someone whose afternoon has already gone badly. Take your time, Congresswoman. I can always read it myself if you need me to. These old eyes get tired too. The laugh that started in the back was the kind that begins small and low before the room decides what to do with it. To understand how the most rhetorically gifted member of her caucus lost an entire chamber over 3 words she refused to say, you need to go back 40 minutes to when she entered that hearing room completely confident she had already won. The room was running over capacity, and everyone present understood why. Word had moved through the Capitol the previous afternoon that Kennedy had specifically requested her appearance before the Senate. Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, 3 broadcast networks had mounted cameras along the back wall, with their recording lights burning steadily. Ilhan Omar walked in the way she always walked into rooms where she expected resistance, as though the resistance was a formality she had already addressed in her mind before crossing the threshold. She arranged her materials. She did not appear nervous because she had made a decision somewhere near the door that no one in this room had earned the right to make her nervous. When the chairman recognized her for opening remarks, she accepted the floor the way someone accepts a debt being repaid. She said she wanted to address something obvious before the proceedings began. She said she had looked at who had convened this hearing, and she believed the people watching at home deserved her candor about what she was dealing with. She said she was being questioned by a man who believed geography ended at the borders of his home state, who had never engaged seriously with a foreign policy document in his career, who had perfected the art of speaking slowly and calling it wisdom. She said she would extend that observation to a significant portion of the men watching from kitchen tables and living rooms across the country who had confused regional identity with intellectual authority and called that a worldview. She leaned back slightly when she finished. She believed it had landed just nowhere near the target she intended. She had just told every gray-haired man watching on a weekday afternoon that his life was a museum piece, on camera. Deliberately. And she thought she had scored. John Kennedy did not react to the insult. People who had watched him operate across years of committee hearings had learned to watch for this specific quality in him, the absolute absence of visible reaction to provocation. He sat with his hands resting together and his glasses pushed low, and he let her finish. He let the applause she had angled for fail to materialize, and he let the silence that followed stretch slightly past the point where silence is comfortable, until the room began wondering whether he had processed what she said at all. Then he leaned toward his microphone, and the first thing he did was thank her. He said, "Congresswoman, I appreciate that. That was genuinely educational. In about 90 seconds, I learned a great deal about what you think of the people who fund your salary and your staff and your office operations." He said the word educational, the way a man sets down a tool he intends to pick back up. He said he was a simple country lawyer who had attended some decent schools but had learned his profession in a Louisiana courthouse where the air conditioning was unreliable and the presiding judge had watched him grow up. He said in that kind of environment you learned quickly that there are essentially 2 types of questions. The questions a person can answer directly, and the questions a person spends elaborate effort not answering. He said he was only going to ask her the first kind today. Simple stuff. The kind a slow old fellow from central Louisiana could track without difficulty. Omar made a sound that indicated she was not impressed. He said he would try to keep the pace accommodating. He did not reach for any documents. This was the thing that those who had observed Kennedy in previous hearings knew to watch for. He never moved toward the decisive material while his subject was still on guard. He asked her how long she had served on the committee. He nodded at the answer with the quiet interest of someone receiving directions to a place they actually intend to visit. He asked whether she found the work meaningful. Then, with a casualness that made it sound almost like an afterthought, he asked whether she considered herself someone who chose words deliberately, the way a trained attorney chooses words, or whether she was more inclined to speak from instinct and let the meaning land where it would. She said she spoke exactly what she meant. She said she had never workshopped her conscience the way the men in this building routinely workshopped theirs. She said if her honesty made her a target, she accepted that condition. She would rather generate genuine opposition than manufactured approval. He said, "That's a fine answer, Congresswoman. My father used to say a person's credibility lives or dies on the back of their own word. Sounds like you'd agree with him. He never completed elementary school, which makes you and an old man's father something of a philosophical alliance." A small laugh on his side of the room. He said, "And you're fluent in Somali, is that correct?" She confirmed it. "Fluently," he said. "I can barely manage English on a difficult morning." "So that's impressive." Another laugh, slightly broader. He said, "Let me just make sure the record reflects something clearly so nobody can say later that the framing got away from us. You say exactly what you mean, in English, in Somali, in whatever language the room requires. Same Congresswoman, same words, same meaning across every context." "That's the woman I'm talking to today?" she said. "That's correct." He folded his hands slightly tighter, and the room did not hear the trap close its first quiet inch. He said, "Hold on to that. I have a feeling we're going to need it shortly." Behind her, a young staffer glanced at a phone screen and held very still for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. No one caught it yet. Kennedy reached for a single page with the casual ease of someone checking a grocery receipt. He said she had made a remark at a public event some years ago, at a gathering of supporters, into a microphone, with the full expectation that her words would be reported. He said he was going to read it exactly as documented because he had no interest in being accused later of distorting her meaning. He adjusted his glasses. She had been speaking about her community and the difficulties it had endured. She had arrived at a specific morning in September of 2001, and the phrase she had chosen to describe the men who flew commercial aircraft into occupied buildings full of working people, the words she had reached for, with the full English language available to her, were these: "Some people did something." He set the page flat on the table and smoothed it once with 2 fingers. He said, "Some people did something." He looked up. He said he had spent considerable time with that sentence over the years. He said he thought about the people who had arrived at their desks that morning with their coffee and their calendars and their ordinary expectations of an ordinary Tuesday. He thought about the first responders who had moved upward through collapsing infrastructure because moving upward was the job, regardless of what moving upward cost them. He thought about strangers in stairwells holding each other's hands in the dark. He thought about final phone calls to people who needed to hear a voice before the line went quiet. He said, and the words you brought to a microphone for that morning, with everything available to you, were "some people did something." Like a weather event, like a parking inconvenience, like a thing that happened to the calendar. He said, "I'm not going to tell you what was in your heart when you said it, because I cannot see into anyone's heart and neither can the cameras in this room. But I can read, and so can every man you described as a museum piece 40 minutes ago." And what those men heard was the smallest language ever applied to the largest wound most of them had ever witnessed. The room went into the specific silence that arrives when an audience simultaneously wishes for an answer and is not certain it wants to hear one. In the third row of the gallery, a man stood up. He was older, wearing a windbreaker, with a small laminated card on a lanyard of the kind distributed to family members at memorial services. He rose the way a person rises when the knees require a separate conversation. A marshal began moving toward him. The chairman raised one hand. "Leave him." The man did not raise his voice. He looked directly at the Congresswoman and spoke in the measured tone of someone who has said the same thing privately for many years and is finally saying it in a room with other people. He said, "My daughter was not some people, and what happened to her was not something. She answered her phone on one of the upper floors and told her mother that she loved her, and then the call ended. We have lived inside that ending for over 20 years now. I coached youth baseball. I taught school. I am not a museum exhibit. I am a father who traveled a significant distance to sit in the same room as the woman who reduced the worst morning of my life to a figure of speech." He paused and placed his hand on the back of the empty chair in front of him. He said, "I drove a long way today, Congresswoman. I would like to hear you call her something." He did not sit down. He stood in the third row for the remainder of the hearing. And every time a camera found the Congresswoman's face, it also found him standing in the background, still, patient, present, the way a fact is present even when no one is looking directly at it. Omar's jaw tightened in the specific way it tightened when she recognized the ground shifting. She had navigated shifting ground before. She knew the technique. You do not try to hold the ground that is moving. You relocate the fight entirely to terrain where you control the elevation. She said, "I know exactly what this is." Her voice found its authority again, because anger was a landscape where she had always had good footing. She said this was not about a sentence. It had never been about a sentence. This was about a Muslim woman, a black woman, a refugee occupying a seat in a building that was not architected with her presence in mind, saying things that generated discomfort in men who had never been required to justify their presence anywhere. She said there was a name for what was being done to her. The name was Islamophobia. The name was xenophobia. She said every honest observer watching knew it, and for a moment genuinely the room moved with her. Pens accelerated across notepads. A woman near the front, who had been close to laughter 40 seconds ago, was now looking at her hands with an uncertain expression. The instinct that word historically triggered moved through the chamber like a current, the deep American reflex to step away from the accusation rather than address the substance underneath it. It held for approximately 20 seconds. Kennedy did not step away, he said. "I want to be careful here, because you've said something serious and it merits a serious response." He set the page down flat. "I am not questioning your faith. I have served alongside men and women of your faith in this institution, and not one of them will tell you I ever held it against them." He said, "The people who had a problem with some people did something were not exclusively gray-haired men from the South. They were firefighters' widows. They were black mothers from Queens. They were members of your own faith community who felt the phrase diminished something they also mourned. You cannot place all of those people under a single word and make them disappear. That word carries too much weight to function as a broom." The reflex left the room. What replaced it was more useful to Kennedy and more damaging to her. It was permission. The permission the room had been waiting for to evaluate the substance without fear of the label. Behind her, the young staffer leaned close to Omar's ear and spoke quickly and quietly. Omar shook her head once, sharp, and dismissed her without turning around. The cameras caught the exchange. They did not capture the words, but the room felt the temperature of it, the way you feel a phone buzzing in someone else's pocket across a quiet table. Kennedy let it sit there, unanswered. He was skilled at letting unanswered things accumulate. He took a slow drink of water. He set the glass down with a small, deliberate sound. The sound was the loudest thing in the room for 3 full seconds. He said, "I'd be close to finished if this were one incident. A person says a wrong thing. It's a big country with a lot of microphones, and we all have regrettable moments. But this is not one incident, Congresswoman. This is a pattern, and the people who pay your salary have earned the right to have someone count the pattern out loud at least once." He reached into a thin folder and withdrew 2 clipped pages. He held them up so the room could see. There were specifically 2, not one document, but a pair, placed side by side, edge to edge. He said, "Some years ago, you made a statement about a lobbying organization. The way a substantial number of people received that statement was that American foreign policy support for an ally in the Middle East was fundamentally a financial transaction." The response came quickly. And here's the detail he wanted the room to mark with care. The response did not originate primarily from his side of the aisle. The loudest objections came from her own party leadership, her own speaker, her own senior colleagues. He laid the first page flat. He said, "So you issued a statement. And in that statement, you accomplished something I did not previously believe was achievable within the structure of the English language." He pulled the glasses down slightly. "You apologized and simultaneously refused to apologize in the same paragraph on the same page. You said you were listening and learning, and in the very next sentence you said you stood by your position. You expressed remorse and retracted nothing in the same document." He placed the second page beside the first and aligned the corners carefully. "The way a craftsman aligns 2 pieces that need to fit together precisely," he said. "I read that statement 4 times on the drive in this morning, and I could not locate the apology within the apology. It is genuinely remarkable writing. I could not produce it if I practiced for a month." The gallery broke. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the surprised kind that escapes before the room decides whether to let it. The man in the windbreaker, still standing in the third row, allowed a small tightening at the corner of his mouth that was adjacent to a smile without quite being one. Kennedy said, "That is not an apology, Congresswoman. That is a hostage note with professional grammar. You deploy the word sorry so the record reflects that you said it, and then you retrieve it immediately so the people you were actually speaking to know you meant nothing of the kind. You have executed that sequence, by my count, consistently across several years. Say the thing, observe the reaction, tell the people who quoted you back to you verbatim that they misunderstood, tell the people holding your own transcript that their reading comprehension is the problem. She said that is a fundamental mischaracterization of a nuanced position on a complex matter that you are not equipped to evaluate. Kennedy said, it's a statement with your name at the bottom, Congresswoman. I didn't author it. You did. Twice, apparently. The apology version and the non-apology version. Same page. The room cracked open a little further. Not the final break. Not yet. But the kind of laughter that builds because people are partly reacting to the content and partly reacting to each other, reacting to it. Omar's hand found the edge of the table. Kennedy was already reaching for the next document, and the room, sensing the direction, went quiet on its own initiative. He said, that one is historical context. I only revisit it so no one can tell the cameras. This is about a single difficult evening a long time ago. What I actually brought her here for is more recent. He withdrew a stapled document. Several pages with a second clipped set behind it. He held it up just long enough for the room to register its existence. He said, this one required translation. He said that straightforwardly, without drama or accusation. He said it was a practical matter. He said it required translation because she did not deliver the remarks in English. He settled his glasses back into position. He said, at an event in Minneapolis, in a hotel ballroom, speaking to a room full of her own constituents, the people who cast the votes that produced her congressional seat, she stopped speaking English. She switched to Somali, a language most of the people in that ballroom did not understand. A language essentially no one in this hearing room understands. A language the country whose legislature she serves in does not speak. He said, and in that language, to that room, she made a commitment. She told them that the United States government would be responsive to their priorities. She told them that as long as she occupied a seat in this Congress, a specific foreign nation's territorial interests would be protected. She told them where her hand rested on the wheel. He placed the transcript flat on the table. He said, now, you've said the translation is unfair. I am a fair man by general reputation, so here is my offer. The page is in front of you. Your words, your occasion, your audience. You read it back to this room in English, your voice, your sentence. The people who employ you listening. He slid the page 1 inch, closer to her. He said, because a person who means the same thing in every language, which is what you told me 20 minutes ago, on this record in this room, that person can read her own public remarks out loud to her own constituents without hesitation. So go ahead, tell us what you told them. He sat back. The room waited. She looked at the page. She did not pick it up. She straightened in her chair and pulled the microphone close and reached for everything she had remaining. And what she had remaining was not nothing. She said, you want to discuss loyalty? Fine. Let's discuss it fully. She said she had arrived in this country with nothing of material substance and had built everything she possessed through acquisition of language, acquisition of education, acquisition of civic standing, acquisition of electoral trust. She said she had learned English to a standard of fluency that exceeded a significant portion of the people born speaking it. She said she had earned her citizenship in a federal courthouse with her hand raised, and she had meant each word of the oath. She had won her seat in free elections repeatedly in a district where voters made informed choices and anyone was welcome to verify the margins. She said she had authored legislation that put resources into communities across the country while he was delivering remarks about regional food culture and his preferred recreational activities. She said he had received his country at birth as an inheritance, had received institutional access as a continuation of that inheritance, and was now sitting in a well-tailored suit questioning whether she belonged to hers. She said she would not perform for his camera. She was a United States Congresswoman. She had earned that designation. She would not apologize for the scope of her questions or the language in which she chose to ask them, and for 3 or 4 seconds the room held with her, genuinely. The heat she generated was real heat. The argument she made about inheritance and effort, and the differential demands placed on people who arrive without existing claims on institutional legitimacy, that argument had weight. Some of the energy that had been draining from her side of the room reversed direction briefly. A pen stopped moving. The current wavered. Kennedy let her finish completely. Then the folksy quality fell away from him. Not dramatically. There was no theatrical shift, no visible change in posture. But the easy warmth he had maintained across the previous 40 minutes simply was no longer present, and what remained was something flat and precise and very still. He said, "Nobody in this room is disputing your biography, Congresswoman. You built something from conditions that would have stopped most people. I'd acknowledge that on any occasion in any setting in this country, and I mean it without reservation." He put one finger on the transcript. He said, "What is actually before this committee is simple. You speak English to us, you speak Somali to them. And in the two rooms you say different things, and you have arranged it so that neither room can hear what you said to the other one." He held there for a moment. He said, "You stood in a room full of the people who granted you your congressional seat, and you switched to a language they could not access, and in that language you made commitments to a foreign nation's interests. That is not bravery. Bravery is making your commitments in the language of the people who hold you accountable for them. What you did is the precise opposite of bravery." He said, "You are not loyal to two nations, Congresswoman. You are loyal to whichever room you happen to be standing in at a given moment." Nobody laughed at that. It went somewhere below the frequency of laughter, into the part of a room where assessments form and stabilize and do not easily change direction again. She said, "Senator, with all due," he said, "we are well past due respect. Congresswoman, due respect was 40 minutes ago. Due respect was before you stood up and informed every gray-haired man in this country watching his TV that his years of living were a museum exhibit and his community was a punchline. I have been keeping up just fine throughout this morning. It turns out the old man could follow along after all." The chairman intervened with the particular authority of procedure which carries its own devastation precisely because it carries no emotion. He asked in the flat declarative tone of institutional process whether the gentlewoman would assist the committee by reading the highlighted passage of her own public remarks into the official record in English for purposes of accurate entry, and he said specifically, in fairness to her own objection regarding the adequacy of the translation. In fairness to her, that was the element that made it complete. It was not a trap framed as a trap. It was an accommodation. He was offering her the opportunity to correct any translation she found inadequate by providing the authoritative version herself, framed as assistance, framed as fairness, and the page was directly in front of her. She picked it up. Her hand was not steady. Every camera in the room confirmed that her hand was not steady. She looked at the words on the page. Her own words. The English translation clipped directly behind the Somali original, both sets of text separated by a single small black binder clip. To read it aloud was confirmation. To decline was louder confirmation. There was no third option available. The architecture of the moment did not contain a third option. She began. She produced 3 words, the United States. And then her own ear caught what her mouth was about to deliver, and she stopped. She set the page back on the table. And then she did something small that everyone present watched and that she would not be able to undo. She worked the binder clip off the corner of the pages with her thumbnail. The way your hands find something to occupy themselves with when the rest of you has run out of available responses. The clip came free. The 2 pages, the Somali original and the English translation, what she had said and what she had chosen to say it, in a language no one else present could follow, separated. They drifted 1 inch apart on the table surface. The clip made a small, flat sound when it contacted the wood. In a room that's silent, it carried the way a sound carries in an empty building. It moved through the dead air and arrived at every ear in the chamber simultaneously. She did not reassemble the pages. She did not retrieve the clip. She placed her hands in her lap over the 2 separated documents, the thing she had said and the thing she had counted on no one else being able to hear, and she said nothing at all. The clip had a name online before the day was over. Someone had edited 40 seconds with surgical precision, the page sliding across the table, the request to read it in English, 3 words and a stop, the hands working the clip free, the 2 pages drifting apart. They released it without narration, without graphics, without any editorial addition whatsoever. Just the sequence in order. By mid-afternoon, you could not move through any digital platform for 10 seconds without the footage finding you. And the detail that should have alarmed her most, the detail that would take days to fully register, was that no one was arguing about it. There was no fierce online debate, no competing interpretations, no partisan split in how people were receiving what they had watched. The argument had already concluded before it had a chance to begin. People were simply watching a congresswoman receive her own words and decline to read them aloud on a continuous loop, in the language those words had been specifically chosen to avoid. The evening broadcasts led with the still image. Her hands folded in her lap, the 2 pages lying separate in front of her like a document that had come undone. One network displayed it beneath a single line of text pulled from the senator's own remarks. They added no commentary, the image required none. In the marble corridor outside the chamber, a journalist intercepted a Democratic representative who had cast votes alongside Omar on numerous occasions. The representative checked the corridor in both directions before speaking, and then spoke quickly and quietly. He said, "There were people inside our caucus who understood what was happening. We told ourselves it was an enthusiasm problem, a communication issue. We told ourselves she had access to context the rest of us couldn't speak to publicly. We were wrong to permit it to continue unchallenged." A politician can recover from a misstatement. What cannot be recovered from is being handed your own words in the room where your employers are watching and declining to say them out loud. There is no press release that addresses that. There is no statement that answers silence. He left before the recording device was fully raised. The father in the windbreaker drove home that evening. He did not activate the radio. The road unspooled in the headlights without sound. He had driven a considerable distance to be in that room, and he was driving the same distance back, and what he was carrying on the return trip was different from what he had brought. Somewhere past the state line, alone in his car in the dark, he said his daughter's name out loud once. The way he said it most evenings, to the dark, because saying it kept something alive that silence would eventually exhaust. Then he drove the rest of the way home in quiet. Not the old quiet, a different kind, the kind that had been earned rather than endured. In a kitchen, in a state that Omar had characterized as a museum, an older man with gray at his temples sat at a table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold some time ago. His granddaughter had shown him how to find the clip on the device she had given him for his birthday. He watched it twice. He was not a museum exhibit. He had framed houses and repaired engines and raised children and buried a wife and attended every election since he turned 18 without missing one. He had been told this morning by implication that his decades of living disqualified him from understanding the future. He turned the device off. He sat in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the quiet house and the small specific satisfaction of a man who had been counted out by someone who turned out to be unable to read her own page aloud. John Kennedy gathered the 2 separated pages from the table after the chairman declared the proceedings closed. He squared them together, Somali original, English translation, edge to edge, and folded them once down the middle. He placed them in the inner pocket of his jacket. He picked up his glasses and his notepad and his water glass, and he walked out through the side door. He passed the cameras calling his name and did not stop. He passed the empty chair where the most rhetorically gifted member of the opposing caucus had spent 40 minutes dominating a room, and the final 40 minutes unable to produce 3 consecutive sentences from a document she had authored herself. He had arrived with one piece of paper. He left with it in his pocket. He had not needed anything else. The hearing ended. The footage circulated. The statements were drafted and released and largely unread because the statements addressed an argument that no longer existed to be addressed. The argument had concluded the moment the binder clip made contact with the table. What remained was not an argument. What remained was a sound. One binder clip in a room that had gone completely still. The small flat percussion of 2 pages coming apart, the thing that had been said, and the language it had been said in separating on a table in front of the people who were never supposed to hear both at the same time. That sound, half a second in duration, recorded on 3 broadcast cameras, carried across the subsequent days on every screen the country owned. Not because of what it contained, because of what it meant that she had been unable to put the pages back together.